Hello, Suman. Welcome back.
Hi Divya, thank you so much.
Hi,
So
so nice to have you back. I've missed these circles.
I'm also happy to be back.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So, Suman, should we get started?
Yeah, why not?
So, let's start with the title, right? Why should anyone be led by you? I've just come off a very heated conversation with the leadership, and I think it's an excellent one. I am very, very curious to know what made you choose this title. Why this title?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And in fact, I happened to come across this. There's always a lot of talk about leadership versus management, right? And I think what's probably an easier one to managing, right? So who likes to be managed? I mean, do you like to be managed, Divya? I don't.
Well, you know what, Suman? I used to not, and I don't. I think I'm liking it lesser and lesser and lesser. I definitely don't like to be perceived. I mean, don't like it to pop into my awareness that I'm being managed, especially for
Managed.
this. Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Nobody likes to be managed. We love to be led. But and so I think I firmly believe that you manage resources, but you don't manage people. You lead people. Now, this question about why would anyone want to be led by you, whenever you ask that in a group, you get a hushed silence. People are wondering what to respond. It started by I read an HBR article with the same title. In fact, the authors Robert Goffey and Gareth Jones, they actually wrote a book by that name. And what they did is they did a project for over 10 years, just harping on that one question. And every time they would raise this question in front of a group, they would get hushed silence, which was very interesting. So, on one hand, there's so much talk about leadership, right? Thousands of leadership books get published yearly. Yet, when somebody's asked such a fundamental question, it kind of, just stops people in their tracks and wondering, what to respond. So the question really is that, with so much being talked and written about leadership, why is it that why is there still a big dearth, a big gap for leaders, right? Big gap. Why are there so many bad leaders? And this is again data driven because data shows that only about a third of employees really feel inspired by their boss.
Yeah, that is shocking. That is, Suman, can you hear me?
Are you there, Divya?
Yeah, yeah. I was saying that
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I lost
shocking
you in
that a
between.
third of employees feel inspired by their bosses. That is crazy. So let's and you know what, Suman? I think the reason is that leadership has so much heaviness to it, right? There's so
Yeah,
much that word means, and so much that word doesn't mean, right? Like you talked about,
correct.
it doesn't mean managing and managed, right? So
Yeah.
let's unpack the term leadership a little bit. And I think it's worth it to go down this road because I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in what people think of leadership as or as not, right, Suman? So, in your view, what do you think leadership entails? What are, if I had to break it down to, and I know it's simplistic, to ingredients, right? What do you think the ingredients of leadership should be?
Okay, so that there's a lot of ingredients, right, about a leader. It's a very broad topic, but let's start with the person, right? The person who's the leader, he or she. At a very basic level, at a fundamental level, they need to have authority. People should see them as a leader. They need to have the right mindset. They need to bring energy. They need to be results oriented. So those are the fundamental blocks. Now, leaders also work with other people. So there it's about how are they communicating? Are they delegating the work? Are they influencing people? Which also includes inspiring and motivating people, right? So that's the second block. The third block could be about what I call leadership skills for the new age, right? Is the person self aware? Are they aware of what their biases are? How do they manage themselves? How do they manage stress? How do they manage time? How emotionally intelligent they are? Are they good at building relationships? Do they have empathy? When things are not going fine, do they have the resilience to bounce back? So that's another block, which is again some of the new age skills. The next is about after you've done all of that, of course, eventually it's about moving from point A to point B. You want to lead the company to a certain point, which brings in this entire thing of vision. What's the vision that the leaders in the creating? What's the purpose? What is the values? And having got that vision and maybe even a mission statement along with it, how do you get there? What's the strategy? Right? What are the goals? Are you thinking critically? Do you have the technical skills? Are you aware of what the stakeholders are? Do you have a good idea of the stakeholder landscape? Right? Because all those things will help you to start moving from point A to point B. And ultimately, I think a lot of it is about the culture, which is absolutely critical, right? And often we tend to not focus on this. Is the leader creating a culture where people feel safe? Is it a culture where people trust each other? Is it an inclusive culture? Is there enough diversity? Do people feel empowered? Uh, if there is a conflict, can they resolve that amicably, right? Is the manager more like a coach where they're supporting the people as opposed to being, just telling the people what to do? Because again, these are some of the newer things that's very relevant. So yeah, it's leadership is a whole bunch of things, right? And these are some of the elements that comprise leadership.
And this is interesting, right, Suman? I especially like the fact that you said, I think it's so important about leaders and how they react when things go wrong, right? How
Hmm.
empathetic they are and how they are listeners as well, right? And how
Absolutely.
resilient they are and how they handle failure, for example, right? I
Correct.
think so many elements, and which is interesting. I do have and Pratik mentioned that leaders are not as much made as they are born, and this is a quite often thrown about thing, right? That great leaders are born. Suman, I want to, before we go a little bit more into leadership, what's your take on that?
On the fact that it's you're born with it, and because too in
That
between, I
great
can also
leaders
see
are
Pratik's
are
message here.
made and not born. Pratik is talking about how it's less inculcated, and less of a skill, which I believe it's a skill. I believe that you learn to be better at being a leader, right? I
Yeah.
just wanted to think ask you what your thoughts on that were.
So I certainly saying it's a skill one can learn it. Yes, it is definitely learnable, and but that's about the skill part, right? A lot of it is not skill. A lot of it is just, let's say, something like self-awareness. I wouldn't really call it a skill, right? Is the person able to look inward, right? Find out what their strengths are, or something like resilience, something like a mindset, something like building a culture. Those I won't call it a skill, but that's a lot to do with how you know how perceptive you are, whether you have the emotional intelligence, whether you have what it takes to be a leader, right? Now, again, are you born with those? Yes, maybe somewhat, but those are things that you can also build, right? But it requires a certain level of self-awareness to actually know where you need to change, get feedback, and course correct yourself. It takes a fair bit of humility, vulnerability, courage. It's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this brings me to my next point, which is there is therefore all these elements that you just mentioned, right? Resilience, all of the elements, Suman. And we talk. There is so much research, whether it's from a behavior science, organizational psychology, right, human resources. There's so much research that has been done on all of these facets, right, on
Yeah,
all these elements of leadership, and yet we talked about how leadership is very difficult, and there are few very good leaders, right, Suman? There's one third statistic that you talked about, that one third of people don't look up to their leaders, is privy to that fact that there's very very few great good leaders. Why? I mean if it is a skill that we could all learn, a set of skills at least, then why is there that gap, right, between all of this research, all of this material, and good leaders out in the
that's a
field?
great question. That's a great question. Yeah, because if it's these elements and if you can master these elements, that should make me a great leader, right? But it doesn't work that way. So the elements are easy in isolation, but they're highly nuanced, highly interconnected, highly interwoven. So leadership overall is not easy. I think to answer that question, we need to first bust some myths around leadership, right? When CEOs are asked what's the biggest problem they faced, right, or leaders in any organization, interestingly, what they say is that organizations need more leaders at every level, right? So that there goes the first myth that we think leaders are people who are sitting right at the top, but this guy at the top is saying that look, we need leaders at every level. So what he's saying or she's saying is that look, we need people who have these kind of skill sets. Yeah. So leadership, first thing that comes is leadership is non-hierarchical. Okay. A lot of the body of literature that you talked about, which has happened, which is published, thousands of books get published every year, focuses on the characteristics of leaders, which are these elements that we were talking about. Yeah. And the underlying assumption there is that leadership is something we do to other people. Hey, I have this skill, I do this to you, I'm the leader. But I think leadership should be seen more and more as something we do with other people, not to other people. Yeah. So to that extent, it becomes relational, right? It has to be viewed as a relationship between the leader and the led. So every relationship is different, right? So leadership is relational, and every situation is different. So leadership is also situational, and leadership is an action. It's not a position. Yeah. And because of these facets, right, that leadership is situational, action oriented, it's relational, that's what makes it so difficult, right? So one thing that you've applied in a certain area at some point in time may not work, applied somewhere else because you need to do something different, right? Every situation is different. And I think to me, that is what the real challenge is with leadership.
Which is interesting, right, Suman, what you said about leadership is an action and not a position. And I want to actually go back. Something sparked when you were saying, leadership is about, it's not just about kind of taking all of these elements one by one and checking them off. It is
Exactly.
and it's, I think it's one of those situations in which the whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? Because
Absolutely.
it actually then forms a layer of your personality, right, Suman, in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
sense that you need to have that set of, and I don't want to call it skills because it's way more than that now, right? I see that, but you do need to have these set of these very very important elements in your personality to be able to be an effective leader, right? Leave alone good
Correct.
or like leader. And I think that's another one that I would love to talk about, which is effective versus liked, right? As
Hmm.
leaders, which would be an interesting conversation to have, right? But to be an
Absolutely.
effective leader, I think there are some of these, it's almost a personality, what do you call it, a bunch of traits that you need to have. And that's why I think what you said about leadership therefore becomes an action which is the outcome of those traits, right? And not so
Correct.
much a position, which is where you are in the hierarchy of an organization or anything, right? It's about the
Absolutely.
respect that you govern, it's about the respect that you instill. I think Pratik, that kind of fits a little bit with what you were saying. But very, very interesting. And I like the word Pratik has used, which is the manifestation of leadership, right, Suman?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Um,
agree completely.
yeah, I really nice. So how do we do this then? How do we make ourselves better leaders, or how do we address this gap, right? And I'm not looking, and I know it's not a hack or an easy way or an easy fix, right? Because we talked about this, but what would then be certain things I could at least mentally prepare for, right? If I want to be an effective leader.
So one is, of course, all these elements which we need to understand the interdependencies and understand that it's situational. So it's a journey as like everything else. One doesn't become a leader overnight. But at the same time, if you have to address the first question that we raised, why should anyone want to be led by you? They did a fair bit of research there, and what they found is, and let's take an individual. Let's say I want to be, of course, led by who? By somebody who has these characteristics, but also somebody who's inclusive, right? Somebody who empowers me, somebody who gives me autonomy. But above all, I want to be led by someone I can relate to, right? Who I see as authentic, not a fake leader, not a leader who's just read some book and now trying to do something different from what I saw yesterday, right? So I think a lot of it boils down to being authentic as a leader. Okay. And authenticity is not just following the rules. It is about a few other things, few other characteristics over and above what we discussed, right? So one thing about being authentic is uniqueness. right? Each leader is unique. Each has a different style. Now, I can read a book on Elon Musk and I can read books on Ratan Tata, but I can't be like them, right? And I should not even try to emulate them because everybody's style is different. And if you try to emulate them, basically, the trust only erodes. Just a simple example. So I had a boss who used to walk in one of the companies I used to work with. He used to walk, he's a very, very powerful guy. And then, people used to really have had high respect for him. But I noticed when he used to walk around the office, he used to walk slowly with very gentle, deliberate steps, right? Seeping it all in. He was almost like stalking, right? As he moved around. Now that was his USP. There was another well-known leader who always walked the floor and overtook people, using his own pace as a means of communicating urgency. You know, it worked for him. But the two are diametrically opposite. There's nothing right or wrong here. Each has a unique style. The same is true for decision making, right? For instance, in that continuum, I could be more authoritative or I could be more democratic, where it's more of a consensus style. Now, which one is good, which one is bad? It depends on the situation. But what happens is if I suddenly change my style, let's say I'm a very authoritative guy and I come and tell the team what to do. And one day I come and say, hey, you know what? Let me listen to what you guys are thinking. Now, what are the guys thinking on the other side? Oh my God, what happened to someone today? You know, there must be some ulterior motive. Why is he asking us? Right. So they're not trusting me because I've changed my style suddenly. So it's better to stick with a certain style. So, when you change your style suddenly, it lowers trust. Yeah. So authenticity is about being, having your uniqueness, but at the same time, be conscious of not randomly changing those styles, right? So that's one part of authenticity. The other one is about empathy, right? And the problem there is, I talk a lot about empathy. In fact, I'm happy that today empathy has entered the mainstream. It wasn't when I wrote my book a few years back. And I think the biggest challenge is people think of empathy as people oriented, and they think that's opposite of task oriented, right? Oh, you're people oriented, that means you're not task oriented. I think that's not the case. It's about a balance between the two. It's not about being lenient, right? But it's a way of managing people so that way of leading people so that they're still inspired. You challenge them definitely, but not threaten them, for instance, right? You empathize with the people, but care intensely about the work itself. It's a balance. It's a balance between respect for the individual versus the task at hand. Okay. So that's the other part, which is empathy, which is absolutely critical for an authentic leader. The third is about intuition, right? And again, those are the things which are kind of intangible, but a good leader knows exactly what to do at the right time, right? Do the right thing. And that comes with experience, right? You cannot put a finger and saying, okay, this is the skill set or this is the toolbox that he kind of pulled this out from. No, it doesn't work like that. So it's kind of a collective thing. And finally, it's about vulnerability. And vulnerability, I think, is very important, but very difficult. Most of us try to not be vulnerable because, vulnerable has a lot of cost associated. But the biggest advantage of vulnerability is that when we expose a weakness, it establishes trust. When I'm vulnerable, my people see me as a real person with real issues, just like, so they feel, hey, Suman is like us, okay? As opposed to somebody who's just kind of larger than life, who has all the answers. I don't come across as authentic, right? But having said that, we need to be very careful how we are showing the vulnerability. It needs to be a bit selective. Say you go to a dentist and the dentist says that, look, I'm not good at doing a root canal. I don't think that's going to work out too well for you, isn't it? Or if the finance head says, look, I don't know how to do a discounted cash flow, because then you're talking something about your main job itself. You're not this thing about, you're not confident about. No, I'm not talking of something like that. But little bit of vulnerability in small doses basically builds trust because people see you as one of them. So I think to summarize, those are the four things over and above some of the other things we talked about earlier, which builds authenticity. So one is uniqueness, then we have empathy, intuition, and vulnerability.
So, this Suman, this is very, very interesting. And guys, for those of you who've not checked out Suman's channel, go tap on the channel. You'll see all of these we talked about as episodes, right? Suman, looking forward to a lot more of these conversations. We've talked about resilience, about, empathy, about authenticity. We should talk a little bit more about authenticity. And I can, just by what you said in the last point, you can appreciate how hard this task is to balance the not being swayed with the being assertive, with the being vulnerable. Thanks a lot for this great conversation. Oh, we
Super,
have some
super.
time. Sorry. I thought I saw the timer going down. I did not realize you extended it. So anyway, coming back to what I was saying that what you just said,
Yeah,
I'm going to pick out points of what you just said before this, right, Suman, where we talked about how leaders have to be vulnerable, right? It
yeah,
absolutely shows, and it's I think an important part of authenticity as well, because
yeah,
you can't relate to an automaton who's just like emotionless, feelingless, and just spouting all the right things is not a leader, like you said, right? So the
yeah.
right amount of vulnerability. Okay, I was getting a call, so I don't know if you can hear me now. Hello.
Yeah,
Hello.
go ahead, go ahead. I'd lost you in between, but it's good now.
Sorry, yeah, I was getting a who couldn't reach me. But yeah, I was saying the right amount of assertiveness, right? And then you mentioned in the middle there that you should not be easily swayed, and you stick true to your style, your leadership style, right? If you have a lot of feedback coming in that this is not a great leadership style, you should be more receptive, you should be more this, you should be more that, and you suddenly wake up one day and change your leadership style, that itself can throw off people. So just imagine, Suman, balancing all these aspects, right? Balancing the fact that you have to be assertive, vulnerable, stand your ground when when it's very, very important, but at the same time be empathetic, authentic. You appreciate how hard this tightrope walk really is.
It's incredibly difficult. Yes, absolutely.
But yeah,
Best of leaders, if you ask them, I mean, if you ask them to rate themselves, it'll be, I'm sure that it'll be, they'll also say we have a long way to go.
absolutely, and I can totally see why.
Yeah.
But there's some very interesting comments on the comment section, right? Suman, there is Sharji listed out 5 things that he believes that a good leader should have, which is caring about the problem, getting others to care about the problem, resolve to solve it, right? Empower and care about others solving it, and show up when the problem is being solved. I think it did in his own way. There's a lot of elements that you brought up that he ticked off in these 5 points, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
yeah, there is this Krishna, Pavan, and all chiming in about what they believe an effective leader should be like, right? Believing in the people and so on and so forth, which just makes you appreciate how much more tricky this is when everybody else also has expectations of what a leader should be like, Suman. Do you want to, any ending thoughts, any, takeaways, anything that you want to add?
Two things. Since we're talking so much about leadership, I think one big transition in a leader's mind needs to be making the transition from doing the job to getting the job done, right? And that's what happens when you start leading people. And a lot of people get stuck there, right? Uh, we still feel it's we need to do the job, but that's not how you grow a company or an organization. So one big transition is getting the job done. And so when I ask people, is if you had to summarize in one line, is that what it is, getting the job done? Is that leadership? Um
No.
yes, that is leadership, but that's only one part of it. I think the
Yes.
other part of it is to grow your people, because that has nothing to do with getting the job done. You can get the job done and still not, get grow your people. I think as leaders, our two main tasks is getting the job done and grow our people. I think that kind of and all those elements that we talked about essentially help us in getting there. So those would be my parting thoughts about leadership.
Yeah, I think I love this conversation. I have more questions than answers at the end of it. And Suman, that means that's a hallmark, I think, at least of a great conversation when we have a lot to ponder about. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a series more. I think we should do a one on the effective versus likable leaders. I think I would love to learn a little bit more on that one, Suman. And like I've said before on this channel, that is a particular problem that I have as well, which I would love to learn more about. But thank you so much. Thanks for coming back and restarting this channel and looking forward to a lot many more episodes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Divya. And I've been wanting to get back. It's just been a longish break. Hopefully, we'll continue this going forward.
Excellent. Thank you, folks. And for those of you who haven't, check out the previous episodes. There's some gold in there, and also follow the channel. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.